Senator Rand Paul, how are you, sir?
Very good, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure out there. I mean, the media is starting to ignore some of the candidates, and we don't want them to ignore you. Have you noticed this?
Yeah, I don't know what we're going to have to do. I don't know. Maybe I have to take a chainsaw to the tax code to get some attention.
Well, let's point that out. You have a great video out there. Tell everybody what it's all about.
Well, I decided, I looked at the tax code. It's 70,000 pages long, and I'm tired of chasing American jobs overseas, chasing American companies overseas. I think it's time we scrap the whole thing. And so my staff said, well, how would you kill it if you could kill it? And I said, well, we could kill it with a chainsaw, we could kill it with burning, or we could stick it in a wood chipper. So we decided to have a contest today, and we videoed all three, and we're letting our supporters vote on which way they'd rather kill the tax code.
Of course, you could give it to Obama and call it the Constitution. That would destroy it right there.
Well, there's been a few misinterpretations by President Obama on what the Constitution means, and that's to say the least.
Let me ask you this, Senator. I'm very serious. He runs to the UN Security Council. You guys thought you had a deal with him. He gets the Security Council to approve this. I mean, the guy really does he really deplores our system, don't you think?
Well, when I talk to folks around the country, I say it's not Obamacare, it's not Dodd-Frank, it's not one particular regulation, it's the collapse of the separation of powers that is the worst thing this president has done to the country. And this really is a big deal. And it's not just him. I mean, it happened before him. It's probably been going on for 100 years. But this president has really gone farther than any president in destroying really the co-equal branches that are supposed to have checks and balances. And so now we have an executive branch that's all, basically all powerful. And that's a real problem. And they do what they want to do. And he knew he couldn't win a congressional battle for the last 4 or 5 years now. So he just does what he wants to do and says, try to stop me.
One of the things that bothers me, and I think millions of people listening, is he's only vetoed 4 bills. So 2 things have happened. Harry Reid didn't send him bills. Plus, it seems like the Republicans negotiate with him for bills that he will sign. I mean, it's the lowest veto of bills in modern American history. Reagan vetoed either directly or pocket vetoed 78. I mean, I just feel like we really don't take him on.
Well, part of it was Harry Reid. We did nothing for, a solid 4 years. We just did nothing. We didn't pass any bills. We historically passed fewer bills than we had ever passed before. So that's part of it. But also I would agree with you that there's a lack of sort of anybody who believes in anything beyond the status quo. Like, for example, my tax plan would actually cut taxes. But the common thing in Washington is everybody.
Oh, hold on. Tell us about your tax plan.
One rate, 14.5% for individuals and for businesses. We get rid of the payroll tax and collapse it into a business tax, and you can fill out your tax return on one page. But the reason it's not going anywhere yet is that there are too many Republicans, way too many Republicans who believe in revenue-neutral tax reform. That means half the people pay more, half the people pay less, and we do nothing to really make government smaller. And I've told people, you know what? If that's what we're for, I'm going home. I just don't care to be for revenue-neutral tax reform. Reagan ran on lowering tax rates, making government smaller. And if we don't have a nominee that's willing to do that, I'm really just not that interested in participating. I mean, I didn't leave my medical practice. I don't take all this time away from family just to say, hey, let's be a little bit different and almost the same as the Democrats.
You're exactly right. And that flat tax is a great idea. And get all the power out of the hands of the bureaucracy and the IRS. I'm a big fan of that, so I'm 100% with you on that.
Starve the beast. I tell people, starve the beast. The beast is avaricious. The beast will keep eating as long as you feed it. We need to give it less money. And it's really as simple as this. Go to Iowa, run for president, and say, I'm going to leave $50 million in Des Moines and not send it to Washington. Where do you think the jobs will be better created, in Des Moines or Washington? Let's have that debate. But frankly, we haven't had that debate because we end up nominating milquetoast. We nominate people who really aren't for cutting taxes, aren't for smaller government. They're just for distributing the profits to somebody else. So it's big business versus big labor, but nobody's for small government.
That's beautifully said. We had a guy today who announced for president, or the Republican run, and he's the governor of Ohio, and he massively expanded Medicaid, and he's running as a fiscal conservative. Honestly, I don't get it.
There are very few in Washington who want to make government smaller. They want the power for themselves. And I said the other day, I'm running for president because I don't want power. I want to give power back to the people and to the states. And that's what we ought to do. We ought to really just try to give power back, take it away from the executive branch, give it back to the congressional branch, but really give it back to the states and the people. Almost, probably 80% of what we do in Washington could actually be done by the states or the people.
These sanctuary cities are a huge problem. First of all, I will remind my audience that the left says that the federal government and only the federal government's in control of immigration. Well, that's not exactly what the Constitution says. And they talk about the supremacy clause. And then, except when it comes to the left and it comes to sanctuary cities, all of a sudden they nullify federal authority. What do you make of this?
I think one of the best analogies that I heard about this was if you're in jail for shoplifting in Ohio, but you're wanted for murder in Michigan, when Ohio's done with you, they always send you to Michigan. Have you ever heard of, Ohio releasing a shoplifter that's wanted for murder? It never happens. But how does it happen that a state or a city like San Francisco releases someone and says, oh, we just don't care? And so it's a real problem. And so I've introduced legislation to say that, look, if the federal government has a warrant,
yeah,
has a warrant for someone's arrest, and then we're going to let them all of a sudden go to a state.
Mm-hmm.
And the craziness of that is just it boggles the mind.
All right, let me ask you this: what chance do we have where at least the Republicans will get behind something like this and push it? Mitch McConnell, among others.
Well, I think there's a sense of frustration. There's definitely a sense of frustration, and I think it's rising to the top. And I think eventually there's going to be people who say enough's enough. A good example is, look, we got Planned Parenthood having doctors bragging about selling baby parts. And I think Republicans have run away from this issue forever and ever and ever. And it's like, it's time to stand up and say, look, I don't know anybody in this country that is in favor of selling baby parts. I don't know anybody that's in favor of, a doctor who says, oh, I'm going to crush only the brain so I can save the liver, or I'm going to crush the liver so I can save the brain to sell it. My goodness.
I know.
I've often said that, how long can a civilization endure that has no respect for something like life? And so I think it's time that people will stand up, and I think you're going to start seeing more of it.
What do you make of this crowded field? There's 16 now. I mean, you're sitting there with your brain trust like all the other guys and gals are, and you're trying to figure out, how do I break away from this crowd? I mean, there's only so many media outlets, and some outlets prefer certain candidates. That's quite obvious. I mean, what do you do, and what do you do to make sure you're part of this debate process?
I think it's going to be a long haul, and so I think people will have time. But I do think that, right now we're in sort of a situation where the limelight seems to be going in one direction. But I think also there's a certain seriousness that ultimately people say, who's going to be commander-in-chief? Will they defend the country? Will they make wise decisions? And I ultimately think, when I think about who I want to vote for, I want somebody with wisdom. I want somebody who treats things in a solemn way. I want someone who's reactionary, who jumps to conclusions. And so that decision-making process, I have to believe that the American voter will take their time. And like I say, we'll figure it out over the next year or so.
Last question. This deal that Obama cut with Iran, he usurped Congress. He went to the UN. From what you know with this deal, if you were president of the United States, would you repeal it?
What I would find out is whether or not there's compliance. And what I've really had the biggest problem with Iran is that historically they have not shown really that they have been very consistent or compliant with international agreements. And so that's been my doubt all along, and why I said, well, I do favor negotiations, that really the release of sanctions should have been delayed and stepwise or gradual to ensure that there's a consistent compliance. So let's say you come in 2 years. There's been absolute compliance. I think you do have to consider that. But I think a lot of us fear that they're going to be compliant initially.
The problem is, how do we know if there's absolute compliance?
Well, I think one of the things you'll have to determine, and this is whether or not inspections and whether or not you believe inspections and whether or not there is verifiable evidence of compliance. And all that goes into whether or not we can believe it or not.
If they violate this treaty, hypothetically, and they're building nukes, would you support, if you thought it was in America's self-defense interest, attacking them?
I think military force always has to back up diplomacy, and diplomacy doesn't work without military force behind it. And I think making that decision is a difficult decision. But ultimately, yes, you have to have military force that backs up the diplomatic negotiation that you have, and that we have to say that there has to be force as a backdrop to this. But I think, the decision has to be made, which is the best way to try to have an outcome that is the best outcome. And I think the best outcome, if we were looking at the best outcome from there, if we were to use military force, I think we delay a nuclear weaponization. But I think ultimately what you end up having is you end up having a situation where there are no more inspections, and there may well be a quicker development of a nuclear weapon after that. So I think that as long as we have a chance of negotiations, we should continue it, but it has to be verifiable. And I think the mistake this president has made is that I think he was so eager for a deal that he cut a deal that I think allows the collapse of the sanctions regime before you have evidence of consistent compliance.
Well, I lied. Here's half a question. Obama's really heavily slashing the military. Now we're cutting 40,000 more troops out of the Army. The Army's very concerned about it. Are you concerned that he's cutting too deeply into the military?
I think the most important thing that the federal government does is national defense, and that when you're looking at a priority of where you spend the money, that the number one priority is obviously defending the country. Deciding exactly how many troops or how many weapons or which weapons is a complicated dance in the sense that you have to take advice from those. Do we need more armed fighters, manned fighters, or more drones? Those are technical sort of questions. And exactly how many troops we need, I'm not exactly sure I can give you, a steadfast answer. But I can tell you we do whatever it takes to defend the country. I'm a big fan of John Lehman, who was the youngest Secretary of the Navy under Reagan.
I remember him.
He will often say that while he wants more ships, he advised Romney, and you would hear this from Romney, we need more ships. You remember that from the debate?
Yep.
But the one thing Romney didn't say that Lehman will say is that he thinks we can get more ships by cutting out bureaucracy at the Pentagon. When Lehman was Secretary of the Navy, I think there were 6 joint task forces. Now there's 250. And so government, even government that we need or want, like national defense, can get bloated by bureaucracy.
No question.
So I think we have to determine that we are going to cut spending somewhere.
But for me, the problem is we really are cutting troop strength. We really are cutting readiness, and I'm very, very concerned about this. And I'm no John McCain, by the way. So I am very much concerned. I am a Reaganite. So you're concerned about it? You'll look at it? Is that your point?
Yeah, and I think we do whatever it takes. I mean, the thing is I will do whatever it takes to defend the country. And if it means that we've got to cut 30% of domestic spending in order to ramp up defense spending, I'd do it. But the one thing I don't think is appropriate is we say we're going to increase defense spending by 30%, but not cut any spending to correspond to it. And so we had this debate, when Rubio introduced an increase in the budget of the defense budget, probably like a 10, 20% increase. I said, look, I'll go along with that, but you got to cut it from somewhere. So I introduced a competing resolution, and my resolution was said we increase it by exactly the same amount that Rubio and Cruz and Graham wanted, but I would have cut the spending from another place in the budget. And not one of them voted for my amendment.
And yet the GAO says every year we have $120 billion in waste and overlap.
Yeah, so you got to cut somewhere. You can't just say I'm for national defense and I'm going to just spend it, and I'm not going to cut anywhere, because I think if you do, you end up with a problem that, I do agree that the debt is a problem for us, and that's probably the number one threat to our national security is the debt. So you can't just blindly increase defense spending also unless you're willing to say we got to shrink government somewhere else.
All right, Senator Paul, you take care of yourself. What's the name of your book?
It's called Taking a Stand, and we'd love to have people take a look at it.
Taking a Stand, Moving Beyond Partisan Politics to Unite America. We wish you all the best, Senator. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, take care.